Law enforcement and government agencies struggle with parking citations, often because no one will pay them. Boots or other devices are costly, and they invite confrontation when implied and later removed by enforcing employees. With Tire Tag, you can avoid many hurdles and ultimately promote public safety and revenue collection. To learn more, visit tiretag.com. Welcome to Blue Grit Radio, the podcast that explores making better cops for a better community. I'm your host, Eric Tung. I've been an active police officer since 2007. We will dive into the aspects of police culture, health and wellness, leadership, and mindset. You'll hear from experts not only from policing, but all industries as they relate to being our best with purpose, passion, and positivity. Join me as we share stories, lessons, and advice so we can all be better for ourselves, our teams, our families, and our communities. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Blue Grit Radio. I am your host, Eric, and today I'm joined by Bryan Pitman. So we're talking about pillars of wellness and health all the time on the show, and I'm kind of at a loss for financial episodes, right? And I recognize that. I reached out to Bryan quite a while ago, and my brief introduction is I know he's a former area cop here in Western Washington, and I actually got to hear him present at a local agency that was putting on kind of a wellness clinic. It was free information. So he came in and just gave us kind of the down and dirty. And so often through the years, whether I was a brand new cop or, just literally within the last year, you keep hearing these kind of swirls of like, man, we need more like financial training. And then when you ask about how that looks and what that looks like, people have different opinions, but ultimately I'm really excited to feature and be able to talk to Bryan and share his knowledge and insight with you, the audience, for a couple of reasons. One, as we identified, he is a prior cop, and then now he's doing something totally different, and he's going to share about how those have parlayed into each other and the success there, because we do grapple with this identity piece of this profession that is so much more than a job. At the same time, I want to highlight and maybe nudge those that aren't thinking actively about their financial health, because that is a very relevant pillar to how we live life, and that's really the purpose here, is living life better the way you want to, so you can do and serve the ways you want to. So without further ado, Bryan, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Eric. Happy to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Could you give us a little bit of a rundown, like your background and what drew you to law enforcement? Was it an always thing, or maybe a later in young manness thing?
That's a great question. I came and was brought up in a United States Navy family, so both parents in the U.S. Navy. And I never really thought about going into law enforcement. I always thought maybe I'll join the Navy. And then when I was in high school was when 9/11 happened. And after that happened, I had a couple of friends that went in the military side, and I just decided at that point that law enforcement was my calling. And it's something that I really, really wanted to do. And so I spent just years preparing and taking all the tests. Back when the tests were very competitive, where there was thousands and thousands of candidates. So that's initially what drew me to that.
Yeah, no, excellent. I was in high school as well, and such an iconic time and a life-altering time, regardless of where you're at and how you came up. So what year was it that you're doing all the testing, and when did you get picked up?
Yeah, this was 2007, 2008, and I got picked up by my first department at Bellevue PD. I worked there actually for a year, and then ended up taking a step back from law enforcement for about a year. It's kind of a way different story about that. It has a little bit to do with the recession, a little bit to do with just
I was going to say it was tough. A lot of agencies, whether they did layoffs, they're talking about it, and we actually picked up quite a few people. A lot of agencies did, because others, the budgets just weren't, I suppose they weren't robust or resilient enough, and not to point fingers, it just is what it is. And a lot of people changed seats and had to take a step back as well.
Yeah, you nailed it. So essentially I identified some police departments in Pierce County that I wanted to work for. And I actually worked as a reserve police officer, going in several times a week for free and doing the job, not being compensated at all. And I did that for 2 years and then got picked up by that agency full time. And then I was at that agency. It was Fife PD right next to Tacoma. Very high octane law enforcement environment.
They pack a punch. There's a smaller agency, but man, they deal with everything that we deal with, as far as like a busy, larger entity for sure.
Yeah, very busy. And then I spent 10, 11 years there.
Nice. Nice. Well, thank you for sharing that. And I want to focus on one piece because there are so many applicants and prospective candidates, and then even new recruits that come in that are listening to the show. And for them, I want to focus on the fact that you were employed full time officer at a pretty good sized agency, right? Like, and then you had to take a step back, and then you start doing the job for free, right? And I hear in that from a significant distance, like a lot of humility and willingness to just drive in for this thing you want. And so often when I've talked to people or I hear, just through the hiring process when I was directly involved with hiring, people would say like, "Hey, I want this more than anything." Well, would you're not being successful in the hiring process at this time. Like, are you willing to take some time and look at other kind of parallel roles, like maybe corrections, maybe reserve, maybe work tribal? And then I hear, well, no, I mean, I guess I'll just wait for when it's right. And then again, not to point fingers, but I hear such a difference in that type of response compared to like what you actually did. Was that hard for you to take that step back, or like what helped you, I suppose, adapt that hunger and that drive?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it's two parts. One, from having to take that step back from a full-time agency and going and seeing and doing what I loved, and then being put in a position where now I don't have that anymore and I missed it. And just you have to have such a good internal drive in life. And there's
Hmm.
different ways to measure success. And I think people skew what success really means. And I think it's really important to define what success is in life. And
Yeah.
it's this, people are afraid of that conversation, afraid of like, what does success mean in life? What does it mean in my marriage? What does it
Hmm.
mean with the relationship I have with my kids? So I think it was part of that. And then I was just so driven. I worked a full-time job during the afternoons and evenings as a manager at a large hotel chain, like a very
Yeah.
large, nice
Hmm.
hotel. So not a Motel 6 or anything like that
Yeah. That's hard work too, though.
on
That's a
Aurora
different kind of
Avenue
hard
or
work.
anything like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I worked full time, and then on the weekends mostly, I would cut out of my full time job and then go work as a reserve, and I did it just about every weekend.
Yeah, what you just said makes me think about purpose. And no one can tell you your purpose or your mission, right? We have all these influences, how we're raised, maybe culture, maybe religion, all these things, but you need to identify that for yourself, right? And like being a cop can be a piece and a really excellent vehicle for that mission and purpose, but it can't be like the one thing. And a lot of great people put in for this job and they get picked up. They do it for a few years or they do it for a few decades. And a lot of people put in for this job and they do not. And they're great people too. And it's just, I've had so many conversations with people that were in the hiring process or I'm working with. And then I try to remind them, like, hey, like, this can't be the thing. It's fantastic if it is, which probably sounds weird that I'm like trying to help someone get hired. But I'm like, no, it's like, what's more important to me, like being past my midway point, if I do a full career, is you gotta live life in a way that serves you. And what you just said there, like, what is a successful life? What is a successful marriage? What is a successful career? I mean, we're talking about finance later on in the second piece, or the maybe the main focus of this, but just as well a supporting pillar of this. But success isn't finances. That's a piece of it to let you do the thing, but you have to define that. So I would highly encourage everyone, as I have before, like, start taking some notes. And if that sounds daunting, I'm with you. Like, I've heard that idea for so long, and I finally did it within the last year or so because it was so daunting. Like, I think about and talk about this stuff all the time, but to even put pen to paper and say, like, this is what's important to me. This is what's important to me at the end of everything, right? I want to have lived this way. I want to have showed up in my career this way, whatever the career is. And there's like a line that says that too, because it can't just be police forever. Or maybe it can be, but then I can't control that if it's not. And same with my wife, same with my kids. So no, thanks so much for prompting that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a big part of both life in general, and yes, when we get to the finance piece, it's very symbiotic. You can't have $5 million in the bank at age 60 with no purpose, and then maybe you've sacrificed your health. Who cares? Who cares if you
Hmm.
have $5 million in a bank account or investments if you're not happy or fulfilled or you really sacrificed things along the way?
Yeah, yeah. And I know that the data could be skewed, but there is the negative myth and the narrative and call it stereotype. But regardless, we need to be aware of this archetype where people work so dang much to get up their, their 5 year, right? Like their top five or whatever builds their pension and they're working off of. And then did they overwork so much that they have the money in the bank, but they're not even going to draw that much retirement because their body's beat. their mind, their emotional health is beat. And so like my flip to people that have worked a lot, and like some people that I work directly with, I'm like, hey, let's let's talk about how you can milk that pension, right? That should be the goal. Like you worked your butt off. Like let's get as much of that pension as you can that you've already earned. So like let's flip the script a little bit that direction.
Absolutely. I mean, these are conversations I have with a lot of clients that I have that are in
Love
law
it.
enforcement and also military. The pensions are not identical, but pretty similar.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about the job you did, legit law enforcement for a good chunk of time, and then what changed for you and why the pivot away and why are you doing what you're doing now?
That can be a long question. Let's see. I really enjoyed being in law enforcement. I did it for, I'd say, a total of 11 or 12 years. So not a long time, but not a short time.
Definitely not short. Not in a place
No,
like 5.
and especially in Pierce County, right? I always tell a lot of my friends and anyone that's in law enforcement, especially out of state, that 10 years in Pierce County is like doing 30 years somewhere else, like in a more rural, slowed down environment,
Yeah, it
because you're
can be
just
for sure.
you're just dealing with so much stuff every day, right? Lots
Hmm.
of high octane calls and a huge diversification, right, to use a finance term, of just different crimes, and having to be
Yeah.
able to put on those different hats and advocating for domestic violence victims, going out to a crash scene, which I enjoyed a lot. I was a collision reconstructionist for
Mm.
several years, so I went all the way through all the different schools
The math was there. The
until
math was
recon
there.
school. So
Yeah.
yeah, part of my background in college was I studied two things: criminal justice and economics.
Mm. Hmm.
For the longest time, I'm like, I'm never going to use some of this economic stuff. And then I started to do collision reconstruction, and knowing a little bit of background with physics and math, obviously, I was really good at that. And it was fun. I really enjoyed it. And something that I never really thought that I would enjoy as much was, at times, being the lone person in a courtroom for an advocate for a family that lost someone, where we had to hold someone accountable and testify at an expert level on why this crash happened. Why is this person responsible? So that's something that I was really drawn to, and I did that for a significant amount of time, probably 3 years. And then I was also a drug recognition expert, a DRE.
Yeah.
I was a FTO. I was a trainer in a few other things that had to do with distracted driving, impaired driving. I was on a couple of DUI task force, so racked up quite a few DUI arrests, as well as just helping the entire state. I went around the state and trained officers and troopers on field sobriety tests and other things that had to do with that specialty.
Yeah. Yeah, that is if anything, you really niche down, and like thank you for your time. And I like to say like thank you for your service, whether, folks out there did a few years or, you did just about a dozen, which is no joke, is an impressive feat. And I'm kind of smirking over here because I feel like a lot of listeners in are like, man, I want to try to recruit them to come back, take my collisions and take my DUIs. So you sound like that excellent kind of patrol crew member, as well as a lot of people are like, man, cop stuff, economics, all right, you're hired as far as the finances. So yeah, let's get to that. And where was the pivot for you there?
So the pivot came between a couple of injuries that I sustained pre-COVID and then right around the year of COVID, which was very, as you know, very odd time to be in policing.
It's a hard time.
I could talk about an hour about that first week during COVID. It's just bizarre. So I racked up a couple of injuries, went to a couple of traumatic calls, and then those injuries ended up just stacking on top of each other and essentially forced me to leave law enforcement, which was incredibly jarring. It wasn't something I planned for. It wasn't something my wife planned for, because not only was I having that identity crisis of being in law enforcement, of putting on the uniform, and I understood that, right? Because they teach you that in the academy. They've taught that in the academy for decades, right? That you're more than the job, but it's so hard to detach yourself because it's such a unique profession. So even my wife became kind of attached to that identity as well. And so it was hard for her too.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you personal stories. A couple of years after I left law enforcement, and I had been in finance for a while, and we went to a nonprofit event for a group called Stronger Families, which is a law enforcement and military nonprofit. It sounds like you're familiar with.
And I've heard of it. And then, for listeners that don't listen to all of them, go back shoot, it's like episode 180 something. But Sean Barnes, the current director of Stronger Families, was on. So yeah, check that out. Sorry to interrupt. Please go ahead.
No, you're totally fine. So we went to one of the events for Stronger Families. And again, this was after I left law enforcement. And I took my wife and, we donated some money. And I've done a few things and events for Stronger Families and some other nonprofits in the state because it's so important to me. And she was with me at the event and heard some of the stories about officers that had struggled with different things, some similar to me, some different. But really, what really hit her was that the service that Stronger Families was providing was something that we either didn't know about or didn't have access to. And she broke down in tears at this event and cried next to me and said, why didn't we have something like this? And it's just, it's kind of a unique thing that some people don't understand about that identity thing, that it can also transfer to your spouse.
Yeah. That's huge. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for highlighting that, because we do have episodes where we talk about the family aspect, and I think we're just scratching the surface. Like, we've come a long way as far as first responder culture, talking about all the health dynamics that are not physical, and then we also are doing better talking about the home dynamic and the off-dutiness, and then family, like spouse, partner, older kids, younger kids, like all these other things that are they're just so complicated, to use a really simple word. Not like really try to pick that apart too much, but you're absolutely right, because just like your bond with your crewmates, like back in the day, you're going to calls and all this craziness and the things that might be absolutely disastrous, and a lot of us have handled things that are absolutely disastrous, and then everyone else who hasn't has been to that call of like, this could go a really bad way, and you're wrapping your head and your mind around all that. Well, so is your spouse, right? They're watching the news, or if they're trying not to watch the news like me, they're seeing stuff on social media. They're hearing things from their friends. They're seeing things on, the local Facebook or whatnot, like the local update on Facebook. And so they are taking themselves there too, and having these really heavy thoughts and hopefully conversations, but if not conversations, like probably heavier, tenuous thoughts. And they're also potentially having them with their peers who are other spouses, other partners, and if they're not, then they're even more challenged with the isolation aspect of all that. And so thank you so much for highlighting that.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. Back to the story about the pivot. So I found myself, there I was, leaving law enforcement, really not knowing what direction I was going to be going. I knew that I was leaving. I had a couple of months ahead of time to kind of prep. And actually a year prior, I had been so interested in just finance and economics that there was a certification test that you can take on your own without being sponsored by a financial firm. Most of the other registrations and designations, you have to be in the financial industry. You have to be sponsored by a firm. But this one didn't require that. And I was just kind of curious, what if I take this test just to explore how well I could score on something like that with minimal studying? So I took the test. I did really great at it, right? Passed it with flying colors. And then I used that information to go, I need to make a change for myself and my family. I don't know what that path is going to be. And I'll talk about paths later, because I think a lot of people should understand what that word means. I think it's super important. And essentially, to boil it down without droning too much on about this, I decided to interview for a financial firm. And I did research and I looked at a lot of different firms, public ones, private ones, large ones, small ones, and essentially landed at Edward Jones, a firm that has a deep culture, a long storied history dating back to 1922, which I find very fascinating because I'm a big student of history as well. And I put in an application, and it was a very long process. It was almost as long as getting hired for law enforcement,
oh my gosh.
Including requiring to have a sample of my hair for like some testing, which I was like, that's interesting.
Wow, look at that.
I think it was part of a drug test or something like that. I don't know.
Okay.
So then landed at the position that I find myself at now. I'm a financial advisor for Edward Jones. We're one of the largest firms in the country. We're a private firm, which means we don't have shareholders or quarterly results or expectations to really worry about. Yes, we're a business just like any other. Businesses have to have revenue to exist, right?
Yeah.
But truly great businesses need to be doing more than just that. I mean, you look at really great businesses and they're doing something for people. Yeah. And so that's what drew me to this firm and this industry is every day I get to use the math part of my brain, which makes me very happy. But then I also get to use the people part of my brain, and I wear my heart on my sleeve, and every one of my clients or every person that I meet knows that. And if you're just a genuine and authentic person in this industry, you will be successful. If you try to put on a show or you put on a face coming into the office, then people can see that, and they can smell that a mile away.
Yeah. And I felt that. I mean, I felt that when you did your presentation. I didn't know you prior, even though we were, just a commuting distance, a kind of a long stone's throw away from, where we each worked at the time. And, shout out to Sergeant Laura, at Issaquah for bringing you in and facilitating that. That's a lot to facilitate an event like that. But you made it very clear that you have this heart for service. And I want to flip that back, again, acknowledging part of the audience, saying that just what you said about like being a financial advisor, people can see through the BS. Same thing for being a cop. And just as you found yourself so service minded and service bound, and that's what took you to law enforcement, and that's what has shifted you over to helping people carve out the lives and the stability and the dreams that they want. That same thing is like what responsible agencies are looking for, and they try to suss that out through interviews and through other practices, right? Like, I want people that are here to serve, not just like, yeah, I'd like to serve. Give me put me in, coach, and I'll show you what I can do. It's like, no, show me what you can do in whatever you are doing in life, whatever job that is, whatever communities you're involved in, whatever your family structure looks like. Show me by virtue, not of what you say you'll do, but what you're doing.
That's great. I had never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely 100% correct.
Thank you. Thank you, man. Oftentimes, there's a lot of candidates that want to take the next step in the organization and promote. However, they find themselves at an impasse with where to start. I've prepared a guide because I want to help everyone, no matter what their confidence level is in public speaking or recognizing the different elements or how to show up your best way and highlight your leadership style. A lot of times, those folks know exactly what it takes to be a leader because they do it at the line level. However, they are surpassed by those that simply test better, have the gift of the gab, whether or not they actually can put anything behind it. So for more on the guide, you can find it at bluegritwellness.com. That's the promotional guide at bluegritwellness.com/shop. Man, and we could keep going, and I'm glad we ironed out a lot of that purpose. And, we talk about that, a lot of times things happen, and they might happen at work, they might happen outside of work, but then you can't do this job that you intended to do. And I love how you illustrate that so well with your own journey, finding purpose and finding your path and where you landed and why you landed at your firm. So I did ask you to share with the audience, for the audience, like, I didn't go super in the weeds, but I just recognized so many people, not even just first responders, just so many people aren't mindful and strategic about their financial situation. I've even talked about how I'm not. So that's why I do outsource a lot of that, right? It's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but a lot of that is because of planning. And there's a lot of people that do really well for themselves. They are conscientious, but they don't plan. And so where would you have the audience start thinking, maybe just broadly, and like as we walk into this conversation of how they can start thinking about their own financial planning?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the first important thing to note is, especially with law enforcement, is that it's a community that has unique challenges and unique needs. I bring that up a lot in speaking engagements that I go to across the state. What do we find in general with relationships? Because I like to kind of come back to that, is relationships sometimes fail because of a couple of different things. One of them is finances, and there can be other reasons too. But then when you look at the subset of law enforcement and understand that law enforcement statistically, whether you see it anecdotally or not, has a higher divorce rate. It's just been like that for a very long time for different reasons, and those reasons have changed over the decades. So I think understanding those two things with a law enforcement family means that you have to, number one, have candid conversations about your finances. You have to be able to talk about things, talk about whether they're opportunities or whether they're challenges. You have to be able to talk about that honestly, especially if you're married or any type of serious relationship, whether married or a domestic partnership. You have to be able to talk about things. Communication is key.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, I think it's just understanding and recognizing that you might not know everything, and then that's okay. You can either delegate or hire out, right? Find a financial professional to work with, or if you have the time and inclination, you can also research some pretty baseline things on your own as well. And then when you reach a level of potential complexity and where it might make sense, then you might want to bring in a financial professional to take a second look.
Yeah. No, that's really good how you outlined that. And I think we do talk about communication and trust. And, we're talking about the spouse and family aspect earlier. And so great way to bring that back up, right? Like this is not just our decision, right? For many of us. And some of us, yeah, it absolutely is. But for others, it is part of this integrated, like this is about the family. This is about our future, right? And so I like something that I heard relatively recently, which is it's I suppose advice or guidance to think about your relationship or your family or your marriage like a project. And you brought up good, successful businesses earlier. And I don't want people to hear this weird where it's like, no, your relationship is not a business. But if we want it to be a project and a successful one, then we need to sit down and do some check-ins, right? We need to talk about finances, and we probably should put it on a calendar unless that's kind of automated in some way, or that's how you automate it, right? Make it fun, make it a date night, and then roll into this. And then once you're done with the nitty-gritty business part, then you go back onto your date night, right? And so it is to bring that stuff up, not just sweep it under the rug. Where would you have people start, right? So a lot of audience members have tuned in, they've downloaded, they're like, okay, cool, I'm into this. I love the earlier conversation. Like, now what do I do? Like, where do I even start?
And when you say start, do you mean just like reviewing your own like personal financial situation? Or
Yeah,
what do you
maybe
mean?
that's it. Like, so maybe you made a nod to it. Like, you got to take inventory of where you're at, and maybe this will be a conversation for the pathways that you mentioned earlier and what that means.
So yeah, the path, that's more of a mindset thing, right? So understanding your purpose and just the mindset behind having either financial conversations or relationship conversations. I'm a big believer in that. I think my also second career down the road could be a motivational speaker, because I'm big into motivating people, but
Yeah,
I probably
I'm kind of hearing this like
do
life
something like
coach,
that anytime
life
soon.
advisor thing alongside the financial advisor, which is it's very appropriate and it makes sense too.
I mean, just naturally, that's what good financial professionals will do, is talk about the why behind some of your decisions, and putting some type of purpose to, oh, here's my 401k, or, the 457 part of my plan,
Mhm.
right? I have X amount of dollars in it. Okay, but what's the purpose of it? Like, what are you going to do with it? What are your goals? So I think to answer your question, I think the most important thing is to understand what your current situation is. And that can mean different things, but generally it means, what are your current assets? What are your current liabilities or loans? Understanding what we call a statement of financial position, otherwise known as a balance sheet in the business world, but understanding, what assets do I have? What loans do I have? What debts do I have? What does my cash flow look like? What do I do with that cash flow? And then you dive into different planning topics that have to do with, where can that be more efficient?
Yeah. So, and again, none of this is specific prescriptive financial advice. Brian is giving us a lay of the land. So I really appreciate that. So basically what I'm hearing is like, you gotta track like where you're at, what you have. So what funds do you have? What accounts, do you have a house? How much of it is paid off? Things like that. What debts, as you pointed out, credit card or otherwise, student loans, and then money in, money out. Like what are you bringing in? Like not what you think your income is, but like what are you getting in a check or a direct deposit to your account, and what's going out? Like what are all the bills? And that could sound like a lot, but if you chip away at it, I would encourage people, like it generally would be somewhat well. Hopefully, it's not anything out of the ordinary month to month, and if it is, then hopefully because you're looking at all these sheets. Is that fair to kind of say?
Yeah, and you have to find a balance between being too, I suppose, clinical, looking at everything like that, because that's really not what the majority of Americans even do at a very good level, right? They don't sit down and write out their budget. There's a very low percentage of Americans, probably people in the world, that write their budget out. And it doesn't necessarily have to be with that, but I think it's more about understanding, what are your financial priorities? Do you have an emergency fund? Do you have high interest debt that you should be focusing on? Right? Should you focus only on high interest debt and reducing that? Or should you focus on building up your emergency fund? Or do you do both of those at the same time? It just depends on an individual situation. But I think it's just important to understand, what are the financial priorities that you think you have? what are some financial goals, and really understanding and putting a subset of what I call, of what's known in the industry, both with financial situations or with life coach, right, is developing SMART goals, right? A lot of people might have heard of that, SART, SMART, and that stands for identifying a specific, measurable, attainable, help me out, what's the R?
So I've heard it a couple ways. I think you said, well, I've heard it as realistic, but that's also attainable sometimes. And I think you used a different word before we started recording, which I also would agree with.
It's relevant.
Relevant.
Yeah,
there you go.
I just remembered it. Yeah, so you need to have goals that are specific, something you can measure, something that's realistic and attainable, something that's relevant to you, right? You shouldn't just develop some goals that's not relevant to you. And one of the most important pieces is having a goal that's time bound, the T, because we say that if you have a goal that doesn't have some type of time attached to it, it's just a dream or a wish.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's just an idea, and there's forcing or prompting action to it, right? That is kind of the automated idea. Like you put it in your schedule, maybe it's quarterly that you sit down with your significant other. But I love how you talk about those. And so, you start with where you're at, right? You take inventory, you take stock, and then to identify the goals, what you want, you got to figure out like where you're going, where you're trending, and then maybe what kind of tools, what kind of strategies you can implement to adjust course. And that's kind of where, you were talking about, okay, do you build an emergency savings account or do you pay off that extremely high interest loan? That would depend on where you're at and where you're trying to go and how soon and all these benchmarks, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. So we talk about that. We talk about goals. What are some other things that you have people think about as they are trying to grapple with all these ideas and figure out like what they need to initiate to jump?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we see is most Americans in law enforcement is no different, is they really have no idea how much money they need to accumulate for retirement. Like if you're talking about a retirement goal, some people have maybe a number in their mind, but there's a better way to really understand what that is, and it has to do with planning. It has to do with understanding what your expenses are now, how that's going to change over time, how old your kids are. For law enforcement, that can mean different conversations about what age you think you're going to retire or leave law enforcement, right? And close that chapter in the large book of life that you have. And okay, I'm going to leave law enforcement at 55. I'm not going to work a second job. My spouse doesn't work. We're not going to have access to a group health plan. How do we fund healthcare for 10 years before we're on Medicare? Right. So these are kind of that's a very specific example, but I do a
it's
lot
a
of
real
those
one though.
conversations with
That's
people.
exactly what a lot of people are thinking about. And if you're like me, then you're like, that's a lot to kind of chart out. And that's why there are people that do this work alongside you.
Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. Is I think people need to understand where they're at just today, taking stock of what your assets are, your liabilities. I would say that the recurring themes that I get when I go out and I talk with police departments and I talk with officers and their families is they're concerned about what their emergency fund is and putting a goal to that. They're concerned about budgeting. They're concerned about saving for a child's education, and how do we do that in the most efficient way? Do we leverage a 529 plan and try to save for those expenses tax-free with tax-deferred, tax-free growth? And another big thing that we see is being stressed about financial wellness can distract anyone in their day-to-day life or at their job. Having a police officer being stressed about that and being distracted at work is definitely not a healthy place to be for many different reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. What you just said almost makes me think of this metaphor, right? Like, I think a lot of us that are, if you're listening in, you're probably amply proficient in trying to self-develop in all these different ways, right? If you're an active first responder or just in life, right? Like people just don't tune into a show like this or others because they just, because they're just, just, I suppose, resigning themselves to float through life. I think that's fair to assume. But if, like, let's take the example of an active cop. Like you have your weapons, you have your tools on your belt. You've checked routinely, maybe even daily, to make sure the thing is loaded. You know that you qualify and you practice at least quarterly or whatever your thing is. Maybe you dry fire a couple times a week. That's fantastic, right? You work out, and you train case law, you learn it, you talk about in briefing, you watch videos, and you game plan all these things. So as you're driving around, hopefully, although, you are in the yellow, you are pretty vigilant, you're aware of all these dangers, hopefully you're not just like stressed, just existing. Hopefully you're not. Right? We all carry some stress, but hopefully that is offering you some amount of peace of mind that, hey, if a threat presents, I will know it, I will see it, I will communicate it, and I will react based on my training and my proficiency and all these things and my understanding of the law, on and on and on. So it affords us this peace of mind so we can do the thing we need to do, which is our job in carrying on. Similarly, if you have these conversations, right, we all know what it's like to be financially stressed at some point in our life, or we have someone really close to us that has been there. Maybe they're even in a significant financial hardship. We know what that looks like, and we know how that manifests. As you pointed out, like, it is very corrosive to your life and lifestyle and your day-to-day and your stress. And you're carrying that. So if you do have these conversations, if you do sit down, if you know what's coming in, you've had some work put into where you're trending, where you want to be, these different kind of contingencies. If I retire at 10 years, if I resign at 10 years and have to pick up a different job, this is the pension I get eventually. Or if I'm doing 20, 30, what have you, then you have a little bit more peace of mind, right? You know where these things are tracking. So you don't have to just think about the credit card bill every single day, hopefully. So I hope that is like some contextualization that helps people with that peace of mind, that very elusive and very invaluable thing that I think a lot of us are driving towards and really struggle with in one way or another.
Yeah, I think that's very relevant.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. I mean, I knew that the purpose was not to tell people, hey, invest in this and talk about that. There's actually a lot of dangers with that because everyone is so different, right? It's just like, me coming on and saying, hey, you need to start working out. Here's your plan. Like, here's the amount of weight. Here's how long you're going to rest. All these things. Here's how far you're going to run. Like, absolutely not, right? It depends on the person. And as you outlined so well, like their goals, like what do they want to do? What do they need to do? Where do they want to go? When do they want to do it? Is there anything you'd like to leave the listeners with as we think about these conversations of finances specifically? And then please do tell folks where they can reach out, contact you, and learn more.
Yeah, I think a good analogy is if you go to a doctor and you say, I want to be healthy, but I might have some issues. Well, the doctor is going to ask you some questions. They're going to, like, tell me about your health history, tell me about your current health problems, or, what, or you bring up personal training, like, what personal training goals do you have, right? And that could be like a 1 rep max goal. It could be something completely different. It could be cardio related. It could be race related. So finances is no different. Is you really have to understand, I want to be financially healthy, right? How healthy am I right now? And what changes do I need to make today that can affect me in the future? And how can that sustain me financially in a healthy sort of way? I think that's the best analogy that I can give. I don't use too many analogies, especially like finance ones, because I find many analogies in general are just atrocious. But
I use them all the time. Yeah, absolutely.
There's maybe only 1 or 2 that I ever use. Generally stay away from that. Yeah, I would say, what are the core things that I need to do to be healthy financially? When do I need to seek a financial professional, right? Where can financial professionals help with that? It just depends on a case-by-case basis. But I think the important thing is people always want to find a way to do what's best for them. And it's important to be able to learn on your own. But if you don't have the time or inclination to dive into, maybe deep, complex planning, then that's where you look for a financial professional. You look for a financial advisor, that sort of thing. Like, what if you're a deputy and you've only worked 8 years and you haven't, your pension's not vested? What options do you have with those? And there's a few different things you can do with that. I think the 2 things that I'll leave you with is, I talked about the path earlier. I think that's so important, whether it's finances or a relationship or a career, is understanding that the human mind, and this is my motivational speaker hat, the human mind cannot comprehend the negative. It just can't comprehend it. Like if I look at you just as I am right now and I tell you, Eric, don't think about an elephant, obviously you immediately start thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So you can't do that. So the path, the other analogy that I like to use is skiing. I love to ski. I snowboarded for 18 years. I switched to skis a few years ago. I love it. My wife skis, I ski. My 7-year-old daughter skis. She can go down blue runs at most resorts, even large ones, which is pretty good.
Nice.
And when skiers are skiing down certain terrain and there's trees, and you'll understand the analogy pretty quickly, and I'm sure your listeners will too. If a skier is going down a run and there's a lot of these trees, and you're trying to get through the trees and get out of this kind of forested area and back onto the main run, you don't, as a skier, you don't go through that run and you don't tell yourself, both visually and in your head, you don't say, don't hit the trees, don't hit the trees, don't hit the trees, don't hit the trees, because you're going to hit a tree. Because that's all you're focusing on. If you're focusing on just the trees or the obstacles, you're going to hit those. So instead, you have to tell yourself, and this is what good skiers do, follow the path, follow the path, follow the path, follow the snow, follow the path. And then all of a sudden, you're not focusing on the trees or the obstacles, and you're able to follow that path and get to where you want to go.
Yeah, man, I love that. And I've told stories injecting a bit of that self-talk mindset. One being, during my officer-involved shooting, like we thought one of my buddies got shot because he was wincing in pain, and we're ripping his jumpsuit open and ripping his vest off, breaking, trying to find bullet holes. I wasn't really responding at the time, and just saying like, "Are you okay? Are you okay? Are you?" And I caught myself, and I was like, "You're okay. You're okay. You're okay." Right. And then similarly, like there's a time when I was certain I was going to get shot. And I was like, don't fall down, because I was holding the shield, right? And I was in a little element there to hopefully grab this kid, a bystander, out of the area. And I was like, don't fall down. But then I flipped it and I was like, keep walking, keep standing, keep walking, keep standing, right? And my buddy was not shot and I did not get shot. So that's for those that are newer and don't know those stories, good days therein. So I love that, man. So much of everything that we talk about, wellness, leadership, it all comes back to mindset. And that's where I've really been nerding out on just the power of a growth, abundant mindset. And I think you've explained that and you've depicted that in so many different ways in this conversation, in just real talk, like career, life, financial advice, and just health and wellness in general. So I really appreciate your time. And even something you said earlier in this last bit, which was highlighting, that a situation, a goal is going to be different for everyone. And even if we say like, what is financial wellness, man, everyone, that's going to look different for everyone. For some people, it's going to be a certain car and living in a certain locale and traveling to certain places. And other people, it's like, I don't want to have to worry if I can order guac on my Chipotle, my Chipotle burrito. Like I want to say like, yeah, guac every time. We'll double the guac. I don't care. Money's no object. I'm fancy here. So no, thanks so much, man. And please share with us. And maybe this is assumed, but a lot of folks, a lot of different experts of all these different industries and health, I suppose, facets. I don't personally work with a lot of people that come on to share insight. Like I don't hire a lot of the trainers that come on. I don't, haven't been through the program of this like tactical fitness guy. And so similarly, I think it is probably relevant to say like, I don't work with you. Like I don't hire you. You didn't pay to come on. You're just trying to help out. And I really appreciate that. And again, going back to just your candor and your story, that's where I really wanted to have you share that with us. So thank you so much, Bryan. And please do tell people where they can find you, and that'll also be in the show notes.
Yeah, awesome, Eric. Thank you so much for having me on. The only plug that I'll give is I want this chapter of my life to be successful. And in the beginning of our conversation, we talked about how do you define success, and talk about having a servant's heart and serving other people. The only plug that I give myself and my firm is I do want to be successful in this career, but I want it to mean something. I'm not going to get, down the road to where I'm, either retiring or I'm 15 or 20 years in this career. And if I can't look back and say I didn't make a meaningful difference on all of these hundreds of families that I currently serve, I would just be an empty shell of a person. So if people are looking for a financial advisor, especially if you're in law enforcement and you value having someone like myself, right, that has walked in your shoes, your boots, literally strapped on the vest and done the job, then you can reach out to on my website, and I'll give that the website here in a moment. There's different opportunities. You can look at either planning or professional investment management, the two core areas that we work on. I'm happy to review that, see if we're a good fit. And even if we weren't a perfect fit for each other to work together professionally, then there's different things that we can do, looking at, referring out to either other professionals, or maybe I learned something that, oh yeah, I know this other advisor and you're actually a really good fit for them. and they're probably at Edward Jones, but we're such a, how do I put it, a non-competitive firm. We don't like fight for clients. So it's like truly what's in the best interest of the person, what's in the best interest of the client. Just do that. So the website is www.edwardjones.com/Bryan-Pitman.
It's Bryan with a Y, Pitman with one T. Yeah.
And then you have a bunch of information about myself, my team. I have a wonderful branch administrator, Katie. She lives locally here in the Snoqualmie Valley. My branch is located in Snoqualmie Ridge. And happy to have a conversation with anyone that might be listening, or if they want me to review something specific, or if they just had broad questions, I'm happy to have a conversation.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Bryan. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for tuning into another episode of Blue Grit Radio. As always, support this community by subscribing, giving us a 5-star review, and following, liking, and sharing posts on Blue Grit Wellness on Instagram. You can reach me there or email me at bluegritwellness@gmail.com. Be well and stay gritty.